Hello, ohayo gozaimasu, and welcome along to today's Naruse a Day review. Today I am considering Naruse dipping his toe, or should that be perhaps his whole person, in the waters of the Geisha film, and doing it in a way that rhymes extensively with his treatment of other different groups of women, such as bar hostesses, in some of his other films. This film, Flowing, actually bears water as both narrative material, thematic referent, and visual motif. The film, in fact, opens and closes on images of water, and there are philosophical permutations and connotations herein that relate to the geisha. The geisha are generally a part of what is known in Japan as mizu shobai, or water trade. It's something that is still used today to refer to theatre and movie and television work, but was initially coined, as it were, to discuss and to define all those typically female workers, such as geisha, who were part of the so-called ukiyo-e, the floating world. And the water trade, the name water trade, comes from the sense of instability and impermanence of this trade, that it's not typically sort of fixed salaried position, but it's something that is constantly reliant on male patronage, on a particular female's abilities, and bookings and money could be difficult to come by at certain times, especially if the woman, the geisha, was not particularly distinctive or skilled. This sense of being not particularly distinctive or skilled is something that definitely applies to the various protagonists of this film. Largely, the film concerns the exploits of one particular geisha house, one that we are repeatedly told is reputable, but one whose geisha are perhaps somewhat past their prime, being in their 40s largely, or even beyond, and who are variously struggling with bookings, with making their way in the world, with making a decent living, being geisha. There are principally a mother and her daughters. So, like the film Lightning, or Three Sisters with Maiden Hearts, an earlier 1930s Naruse film, this concerns a literal family unit and the sort of wider figurative family that is attendant upon it. The mother character, played by Yamada Isuzu, is a struggling geisha. She is the proprietress. She owns and runs the geisha house at the centre of the film, but she has significant debts, principally to her own sister, due to her particular proclivities with money, and the fact that she has been overly committed to men who have taken money from her, and has been unable to form meaningful relationships with potential patrons because she dislikes them. She has been unable to put up the facade, if you like, of treating all men as potential lovers. That has been particularly key to the role of the geisha. Though they should not be likened to prostitutes in any way, they are a distinctive group of female performers. One of her daughters, played by Takamine Hideko, is completely disillusioned with her mother. She lives with her, but although she trained as a geisha in her younger years, showed no particular aptitude for it, did not follow that as a career path, and is now unemployed, looking for whatever work she can find, and generally berating the different geisha within the house. Her sister is a single mom who is quite lazy, quite unkempt, and struggles to provide any real support, either emotional or material, for her young daughter. There are other geisha in the film. One quite old, a 50-year-old geisha, we are told, and one quite young at the beginning of her career. Both variously become disillusioned and disenfranchised with the geisha house. And there are several other key characters who come and go. Typically here, and principally here, is the maid, who is taken on at the very beginning of the film and who is played by Tanaka Kinuyo, the legendary Japanese actress, who here is taking on a role that is quite nondescript, quite, in some ways, irrelevant to the film. She's kind of like an onlooker throughout. But there is a real charge to her presence in this ostensibly nondescript role. She is referred to, her name is not Oharu, but she is told that she'll be referred to as such because her own name is difficult to pronounce and to write in kanji characters. Oharu is a very loaded sort of intertextual sign in the film because of the links to the very recently released Mizoguchi Kenji film, The Life of Oharu, in which Tanaka played the eponymous figure of the title, whose tragic life story is taken as kind of emblematic of woman as social pariah in Japanese history. This is something that is in no way attendant on the role of the maid here. But the fact that she's referred to as Oharu places Mizoguchi's film throughout as a kind of intertextual reference point and a point of comparison with this film. So we are invited to make all kinds of contrasts and comparisons with Mizoguchi's film in terms of their respective treatment of and attitude towards women in Japan, and particularly geisha, who Mizoguchi himself made several films about over the course of his career. What emerges, I think, in this intertextual contrast and juxtaposition is a sense of just how un-Japanese in terms of perceived traditional philosophies a director Naruse is. Mizoguchi, a little bit like Ozu, is often seen to place women in a frame in which his reverence for them and his exploration of their suffering carries deep philosophical connotations and ruminations. This has all kinds of different ramifications and textual effects. But Naruse, albeit he draws on them here as a kind of inevitable adjunct of this sense of geisha, the sense of beauty and the fleetingness thereof, the impermanence of life, and thus this sense of being deeply embedded in the mizu shobai, the water trade. Nonetheless, he stresses material realities throughout and is all but indifferent to these questions of impermanence and the transience and flux of life, themes that are often related back to Buddhist philosophy and, as I said, ascribed often, perhaps too often, I think, to Mizoguchi and Ozu. There is throughout flowing a sense of a further contrast, and that is between the old and the new. As I said, there are young geisha in the film. There are very young trainee geishas in the film, such as the geisha house owner's young niece. And the film closes with a scene in which a newly qualified geisha is brought round to the house to be introduced and, as it were, shown off. And then there are the older geisha, who we see more prominently in the house. But there's no use of this juxtaposition in order for any overt laments for the passing of the heyday of the older protagonists, the lost beauty of their bodies and their art. The way, typically for Naruse, that they resign themselves to the world in which they live, and the ways that they cope with loss and difficulty, the ways that they bond together and fall apart, the ways that their friendship, their familial links, however tenuous they might be, the way that they still provide a solid sort of foundation for them to continue with their lives, is something that Naruse celebrates, and I think is completely irreducible to philosophical precepts here of flux or impermanence. There's very little sense of that in the material realities of day-to-day survival that his characters are faced with. And I think Naruse understands that any use of these characters for philosophical ends would be a kind of sentimental imposition on his part, and he completely refrains from that. And as I said, I think the implicit sort of juxtaposition with Mizoguchi is used to set Naruse's vision apart and stress how different a vision of women, of geisha, this film really is. There is a key point to the context in which flowing was made that also has ramifications for considering, however implicitly, notions of change and instability. And that is the fact that it was produced in 1956. This is a particularly significant year because it was the year when prostitution was officially outlawed in Japan. Mizoguchi also was at the same time responding to this, and the result was what would become his final film, Street of Shame. And as I said, although this film is not at all about prostitutes, and one should never conflate the geisha with the prostitute. They hadn't been conflated for centuries by this point. What we should note here is the common sort of problems and provenance of both geisha and prostitutes. The fact that, although not the same, they offer interesting mirrors one of the other. This is particularly so to the extent that both are open for and absolutely require for their sustenance male patronage, and the sense of women at the threshold of men really bespeaks the extent to which Japan as a patriarchal society deeply embedded gender inequality and gender division in its sort of social practices. There is a further contrast with Mizoguchi to be made here with the aforementioned Street of Shame. Prostitution is never overtly depicted within Flowing. The protagonists never discuss it as a facet of their life and work. But as I alluded to earlier, they're also never actually seen at work. So we could argue that its haunting shadow may be said to loom large over their activities. These women's dependence upon men for their livelihood, their financial patronage, is raised throughout the film. It's something that is raised in particular when the older geisha, Someko, returns to the geisha house very drunk and berates her mistress for the latter's belief that women can be independent, that they can live without the aid or assistance of a man. And elsewhere, there's a scene in which the young girl needs her father's intervention to help with medical bills. So, both professionally and personally, the necessity of men is stressed throughout the film, albeit this need is presented quite negatively. The men are depicted such as they are, as seeing themselves as being financial benefactors in a world in which women are incapable of making any headway either in their personal life or their professional activities by themselves. So if the single setting of Flowing, its ensemble cast and emphasis on an increasingly problematic and vanishing way of life are to the fore, then this suggests a mirror image of Street of Shame. This is further underlined, I think, by Naruse's treatment of his protagonists, where the identity and selfhood of Mizoguchi's women in Street of Shame remains inseparable from the fact of their socially constructed and codified performances. The women in Flowing are, as noted, never shown engaged in their profession. Naruse's camera rarely leaves the immediate environs of the geisha house, Tsuruta House it's called. It shows bookings being taken, characters preparing for and returning from an evening's performance, but these performances are never ever directly dramatised. The most that we see is a samisen practice with various different characters, and thus the protagonists are seen throughout as women first and geisha second, which is in direct contradistinction to Mizoguchi's insistence that his women's lives are entirely delimited by their social roles, by them being geisha or more specifically prostitutes. The head of the house, Otsuta, Yamada's character, says at one point in the narrative as she prepares to meet a potential client that all those special things about a geisha are disappearing. Young geisha today are just like any other women. It's a statement that crystallizes the depiction of geisha, who are, in a sense, no longer geisha. They haven't, and perhaps even can't, refine their art to the extent that women once could. Moreover, in the light of the anti-prostitution bill of the year of the film's production, of what was a fundamental sort of negation of a specifically Japanese historical tradition, Otsuta's somber pronouncement not only suggests the gulf between contemporary Japan and the country's past, but also the fact that women can become geisha in the same way one can talk of them becoming prostitutes, for example, without any formal training, as something to turn to almost as a last resort in order to sell themselves, in order to make money, without having to devote their lives to refining an art, even for the edification of men. This particular tension is dramatised by Naruse through the relations between his protagonists and how they regard one another throughout the narrative of Flowing. It is largely through Oharu's eyes, Tanaka Kinuyo's character's eyes, her personal presence around the house that is repeatedly stressed, even though she has very little narrative import. She's always being called, always available for errands, always being sent on errands, and always her physical presence as an onlooker is underlined by Naruse's quite complex editing patterns throughout this film. Her entry into the house in the film's opening scene makes this diagrammatically clear. She enters the house, as we do, and comes across a drama that is already in medias res, that is already underway. And Naruse even cuts away to this character when she's away from Tsuruta House and engaged in mundane chores such as grocery shopping. The director characteristically dovetails these various characters and stories, seeing bits and pieces of them, but never really following any scene through in its entirety. And indeed, at times, often cutting away from a scene before it seems like the key drama of that scene has been established, much less resolved. As such, the film incrementally builds a mosaic of everyday life, a sort of concatenation of unremarkable incidents that, taken together as they are, present a landscape of normalcy against which to measure and judge the characters of the geisha, their lives, their attitudes, and their actions. As with its Street of Shame, the contrast here is between a perceived grandiloquent tradition and artistic lineage and the rather faded, shabby, quotidian reality of its contemporary manifestation. And this is something that is refracted through a constant discrepancy between exterior views of the protagonist's life and work, chiefly Oharu's, and these characters' own views of their profession, their art, and their own sort of understanding of their identities. So there is a lot to take on board in Flowing. I think it is a film that is very complex, that demands several viewings. It may actually be my own personal favourite of Naruse's films. I'm not sure I've ever landed on what my favourite Naruse film may be, but the more I've seen Flowing, the more I come to the conclusion that it is the most deceptively complex, or certainly one of the most deceptively complex films that I've ever seen. So I would heartily urge you to seek this film out. It's a film that, as I've suggested, has certain non-Japanese or arguable non-Japanese qualities, certainly contrasted with an artist like Mizoguchi. Indeed, when this film was first being widely screened in America in the 1980s, I think in 1985, it was actually referred to as a work that one may find very endearing and interesting if one was familiar with such directors as Douglas Sirk. So the critic writing for a newspaper, I forget which one, I think in New York, was stating very forthrightly that there is a strong sense of a commonality between Naruse and melodramatic directors in Hollywood, such as Sirk. So do seek this film out. Let me know what you think. Leave your comments below. Like and subscribe, or don't like and don't subscribe. Follow me on X at AdamBingham01, and I will see you hopefully tomorrow for another Naruse review.